Greetings, Culture Warriors. This is Jeff Vieira, author of Culture is Everything, with another dispatch from the front. I'm a process guy, as you'll have gathered through these many podcasts. And when I sit down to do one of these podcasts, my process is really pretty simple. I do a quick search out there on the internet, looking for any story that might be of interest. It doesn't have to be directly related to culture because the whole point is to be able to kind of pick it apart through the cultural lens. But I'll look for something and just ask the question, do I have anything to add to that? Do I have anything to say about it? I will not often even finish reading the article. I'll just glean what it's basically about because I want, as we're going through it, to have an immediate and genuine reaction to it that's not colored by my taking too much additional time to kind of research it. If we're going deep on a company and their culture, I'll also go pull up their website because I know I'll need that at some point to take a look at what they say about things. And the titles of the podcasts, actually, I don't create until I get ready to post them. So the podcast is already done. It's already edited. I'm uploading it. And I think back on, well, what did I really have to say about that? And then what's a catchy way to kind of put that in the title. So the title actually doesn't exist until very late in the process. I don't know what I'm going to say about it when I start. And the title is meant to encapsulate what I've said about it. So that happens late in the game. I tell you all this just to bring you a classic example here. Here's a article that I did not read all the way through. Have not read yet, but I have a little something to say about the topic in general in culture. So we're just going to see where it goes. If this seems a little choppier than usual, it's probably because I didn't have a good idea of where it was going to go. So a little tougher on the listener, but hopefully it keeps things interesting. This article is from Bloomberg, College as We Know It Coming to an End. Don't bet on it. It's by Joe Nocera, and it was published on the 22nd of May, 2020. Purdue is a school that, in the words of its president, Mitch Daniels Jr., promotes density of our population. The current enrollment in the university in West Lafayette, Indiana, is more than 44,000, up 25% since he took over in 2013. Purdue keeps tuition under $10,000 for in-state students, and room and board costs are lower than those of any other school in the Big Ten. Its football stadium holds 60,000 people. Its theater is larger than Radio City Music Hall. Like every other American university, Purdue sent its students home as the coronavirus swept through the country in March, switching to online classes to finish the semester. Its commencement also took place virtually. But when the university restarts for the 2020-21 school year, professors and students, including the second largest freshman class in its history, will be returning to campus, just as they always have. Purdue intends to accept students on campus in typical numbers this fall, sober about certain problems that the COVID-19 virus represents, but determined not to surrender helplessly to those difficulties, but to tackle and manage them aggressively and creatively. Daniels wrote in a letter to the university community on April 21st. He concluded, Purdue will employ every measure we can adopt or devise to manage this challenge with maximum safety, while proceeding with the noble and essential mission for which our institution stands. Noble, yes. Essential, yes. And an absolute financial necessity. Do you remember MOOCs? The initials stand for Massive Open Online Courses. And there was a moment about a decade ago when they were all the rage in higher education circles. Some predicted that online courses would become the dominant mode of learning, allowing universities to expand enrollment significantly while lowering their own costs. Although MOOCs are still around, mainly serving non-students paying for online lectures from high-profile professors, their impact on higher ed has been marginal. The reason is that students didn't like online classes. Neither did their parents, and neither did their professors. Students wanted to be on campus, interacting with other students, going to basketball and football games, generally absorbing the college experience. Parents had zero interest in paying upwards of $70,000 a year to have their children take classes on a computer screen. And professors objected as well. in part because they're territorial and in part because interacting with students during class was infinitely more difficult when the class was virtual. Indeed, the only students who regularly relied on online learning were athletes for whom virtual classes were often unavoidable given their practice schedules. When he was the star quarterback at Texas A&M, Johnny Manziel was said to have never stepped on campus other than to play football. The pandemic, of course, has raised the prospect that universities will have to change dramatically, just like so many other businesses. And the most common forecast is that the future of the university is online, especially since schools all over the country have been doing it since mid-March. One prominent advocate is Scott Galloway, a marketing professor at New York University's Stern School of Business and well-known tech prognosticator. When he talks about what universities will look like after the crisis has passed, he sounds a lot like a MOOC, M-O-O-C, booster of yore. He told New York Magazine recently that he envisions the 50 biggest university brands, Harvard, Stanford, and the like, partnering with the biggest tech brands such as Facebook Inc. and Apple Inc. Together, he said, they'll create a hybrid model with some students still attending brick and mortar school, but many more, maybe 10,000 or 20,000 more, attending online. When asked why students would willingly accept an online-only education, Galloway replied that 50% of this investment is in one thing: certification. He added that your degree largely signals your lifetime earnings. In other words, going to Harvard gives students such enormous advantages that it's worth accepting an inferior experience to be able to put the name on their resume. Galloway also believes that dorm life and in-person classes will be reserved for the children of the 1%, whose parents will presumably pay an even higher premium than they do now. As for what happens to universities not among the top 50, Galloway prophesies doom. It will be like department stores in 2018, he told New York. I assume that's New York Magazine. Everyone will recognize they're going out of business, but it will take longer than people think. There will be a lot of zombie universities. There's no question many Tier 2 and Tier 3 schools will suffer. According to Moody's Investor Service, 30% of universities are running a deficit. The American Council on Education expects college revenue to decline in 2020 by $23 billion, or 4%, and reports that 67% of university presidents are worried about their school's long-term viability. Rana Foroohar of the Financial Times described what may be coming as the hollowing out of America's university system. The university administrators I spoke to, though, tended to describe what's coming in far less stark terms: severe belt-tightening, but nothing more radical than that. So far, the only school that's hollowed out is the University of Akron, which has cut 6 of its 11 academic colleges and 3 minor sports. But Akron was in terrible shape long before the pandemic. It lost $130 million on $221 million in revenue in the 2018-19 academic year and has $341 million in debt. Kent State University and a few other money-losing schools are also talking about major cuts. As for the idea that the pandemic is going to cause a sharp shift down toward online learning, the evidence suggests it's not going to happen. It's true that the California state system has announced it will use virtual classes to educate its students this fall. Almost half the students in the system live at home. Many hold down jobs to help pay for college. This is not an intense residential experience, says Kevin Carey, Vice President for Education Policy at the New America Foundation. This is a different mode of education already. It is also the exception, not the rule. Most schools aren't announcing campus reopenings as bluntly as Daniels did at Purdue, but they're clearly expecting it to happen. At the University of Florida, a blog post on a school website announced that the start of classes was being pushed back a week to August 31st, and it listed a variety of measures the university was taking to manage its likely financial shortfall. The post ended by saying the school was refining its science-driven plan to gradually return to more normal campus activity. Okay, there's more to the article, and there will be a link in the notes for the show for anyone who would like to read further on that. But that's probably enough to have a little bit of a discussion. So we talk about this news in terms of values, and I think we have to reflect that while culture is the manner by which an organization's values are communicated, understood, and lived by its members, the purpose of a culture is to help that organization fulfill its purpose. So in assessing these kind of shifts and trends and buckles in the mantle and tectonic plate movement, I think you have to start by saying, what is the purpose of a college education? And the article alludes to different perspectives on that purpose. When universities started, way back in the Middle Ages, the purpose of the university was to provide a well-rounded education to the offspring of the ruling class. That's typically where the clergy came from. They were the cast-off princes of the family. They had an heir and several spares. What do you do with the spare to avoid the potential for civil war at some point? Well, what you do is you have them don clerical robes, go work for the church. Where do they get educated? They get educated at the university. So that's where they learn languages. That's where they learn theology. As science began to develop, that's where they would learn science. They would learn the art of rhetoric, of persuading people in the university. Going back even further, the university model was built on Plato and Aristotle and their teaching methods from ancient Greece. But Aristotle, who was the professor of Alexander the Great, he taught the children of the well-to-do, of the aristocratic class, he taught them on a hill, employing largely the Socratic method of asking questions and having discussion. They would simply sit around a hill and educate through that serial one-on-one interaction between the professor and the students. They would ponder the great questions and explore them. In the 1950s in America, that was still the model for college education. College was where the well-to-do sent their kids to make good. It's how you wind up with a situation where Ted Kennedy flunks out of Harvard for cheating. What was Ted Kennedy doing at Harvard in the first place? Well, Ted Kennedy's father, Joseph Kennedy, had made a fortune bootlegging during Prohibition and became a very politically influential man within the Democratic Party. At one point, he was the ambassador to Great Britain. So, influential man. His children would therefore be educated in the best schools. How did they get into those best schools? Do you think that they had a rigorous entrance exam? It may have been more rigorous than it is today, but generally speaking, they went to preparatory schools for their high school, private education, explicitly with an eye towards being able to enter the Harvards and the Yales of the world. And then when he got there, it didn't go as well. But the model that used to exist was that a college education, that certification, that degree, represented your entrance into the ruling class. It was a way for the ruling class to anoint its members, to codify their values, and ensure that those people who made it to that level would have harmonious interaction with them. That's a very ancient model. When you look back at Rome, you see a patrician class from which the senatorial ranks were drawn. Rome didn't have a two-house legislative structure. They had one, the Senate. And the senators were to a man, and there were no women, the senators were to a man the sons of the great families of Rome. Every now and then, through great service to the state, a family would be made a patrician family. They called them new men. And there was always a tension between the old families of Rome and the new families. Julius Caesar came from a family that was relatively new on the scene. In the Roman system, you would have two tribunes under the Republic who basically exercised the executive power on behalf of the Senate and the people. By the time Caesar was on the scene, you would have one tribune who represented the patricians and another tribune who represented the plebs, the underclass, the people. Caesar was actually the tribune of the plebs. And so that led eventually to the Roman Civil War and that conflict between the patricians and the plebs. And eventually it led to Augustus founding the empire. The reason I bring that up is that this is the model that universities looked back to. In America, we don't have a formal aristocracy. We don't have titles. Lands aren't granted to be run based on which family happens to be in charge. But if you've seen how few surnames show up in the ranks of our senators and our presidents, our representatives at the federal level, you'll see that we do have an aristocracy. The same names crop up again and again. And the university system was designed to reinforce that reality. In the 70s and 80s, a shift was well underway, whereas the middle class grew wealthier, they were more and more able to send their children to college. No doubt expecting that attaining that university degree would have a similar impact in the 80s and 90s as it did in the 50s. And that simply hasn't been the case. While yes, having a college degree generally improves your job prospects, we all know people who have a degree, have completed their degree, and then are taking jobs that do not require degrees because their particular degree doesn't have the imprimatur that it previously did. Moreover, we have a college debt crisis because people paid so much in the pursuit of these degrees that when their earnings didn't fall in line post-college, they found great difficulty paying them off. And so they have a crushing burden of debt hanging over them decades into their working lives as a result. But the middle class expectation of the university was similar to the ruling class. It was universities are the entrance to the ruling class. Yet, there is a perception, in America in particular, that the university is an educational institution. That the purpose of the university is for those students who are particularly good students during their high school years to continue their education, deepen their understanding, in some cases down more technical skills, in other cases in a more general term. But there's a notion that the university is to help these folks become the leaders of the republic. It's a little bit different than the entry into the ruling class. It's a more of a imparting skills so that they can function effectively as leaders in society. So if the purpose of a high school education is to help people become good citizens, then the purpose of a university might reasonably be said to help people become good leaders of citizens. And that perspective is out there. There's another thread where there's a perspective of university education as preparing people for roles in society which are essential to the bureaucracy. This was true of similar education systems in China, for example, where the reason that people were sent to school was to learn to read so that they could serve in the court as scribes or as courtiers, and to help administer the kingdom. There's still a sense of that out there in Americans' perception of the university. This is part of when you hear Mike Rowe critique the notion that you have to have a college degree in order to be a successful professional. He's referring in large part to this echo. It comes up in discussions where you have the debate between vocational versus university education. Well, if the whole goal is to impart skills to people, why not impart them efficiently through the vocational path? But the vocational path, because it doesn't have the pedigree of entry into the ruling class, was always slightly less desirable on the part of parents. Regardless of the fact that you can get your Master's of Fine Arts degree from Harvard, incur all that debt if you don't happen to be in scholarship or your parents are not fabulously wealthy, and have no job after you graduate that uses your degree, where it's even relevant. So you wind up making less lifetime than the person who went to a voc tech school, picked up some terrific skills, were able to get into a solid apprenticeship, and wound up succeeding in their field. So on the face of it, they may earn many times what the person with a college degree did in this example, and yet their achievement is somehow viewed as a little bit less. So what is the purpose of a university? The egalitarian, the Republican in us cries out against the notion of the university as essentially a parking spot for the children of the ruling class until they're given their positions in society. We rebel against that notion. And yet the university is certainly not serving as a path for the regular kids in the middle class and lower class to make good, to elevate their standing within society. True to some extent, but you see a lot of discussion in this article about the importance of the university experience. What is that experience? It's going to games. It's hanging out with your friends. It's going down to the library before tests and wasting your time chatting instead of studying. It's living on campus and having those late night bull sessions. It's getting into trouble. That's all part of the university experience, right? And you can understand why colleges would push that experience, because every bit of it winds up with a surcharge. If you want to live on campus, guess what? We got to have a dorm, and you got to pay to live on the dorm. If you want to have sports, well, we're going to charge you to attend those games. And we're going to sell you food at those games. You're going to have a cafeteria, and we're going to charge you for that. So every little point on here is a profit stream for the university, potentially. But make no bones about it, many of these universities don't really need that profit stream. The reason is, particularly for the prestigious ones, is they are largely founded by endowments from past graduates, longer-lived ones from graduates who are dead and left a bequest in their estate, and from fundraising, active fundraising in support of various things. So whenever they have a new project, they don't typically pay for it out of pocket. They will ask their graduates to pony up. So when you hear them talking about the primacy of that university experience, when you hear them talking about the financial belt tightening kind of things going on, you should dig a little deeper and keep a little closer eye on it. Will they be abolishing tenure? Because the tenure system, which was originally put in place to ensure academic freedom for professors, has been used instead to enforce the prevailing culture of professional academics and to exclude those who do not hold the same cultural values as they do, which, by the way, their cultural values are very modernist in terms of economics, socialist, and in terms of social policy, the full embrace of identity politics. And if a professor who is wonderful in their field does not conform to that set of cultural values, they simply will not get tenure. But what does tenure do? It prevents you from firing a professor. Not from everything. I suppose they could steal from the cafeteria or murder a student and lose their job. But for most things, it makes it much more difficult to fire, including whether or not they set foot in a classroom at all. It's shocking how little teaching most professors actually do. So we have a quandary here because it's not clear what the purpose in this day and age of a university is. And there are some mutually conflicting thoughts on that. But what is clear is that if the purpose of a university is to educate their clientele, well, there's a lot of things that could be done in the pursuit of that education which don't require a tremendous amount of money. The online vehicle is certainly great because you can produce high quality content that can be consumed and educate people, and yet it's got a very low cost to produce it. I was a great fan of the teaching company, which is now called The Great Courses. I have many of their courses. I really enjoyed listening to them because they were very well done. They took the very best teaching professors, experts in their field, and they turned them loose on subjects that colleges really don't teach anymore. They had some fantastic military history courses. Good luck finding military history courses outside of service academies today. But I certainly learned a lot from listening to those lectures. A number of them I've listened to multiple times because they're so interesting and so engaging. And so there's nothing that says that people cannot learn through that mechanism. Surely they can. And the better quality of the content, the easier they will. As a matter of fact, kids today, given their screen time, they probably have an easier time learning that way than children of my generation and before. But what does it matter? Why do you have to physically be in the same room as the person's reading the same old notes, lecture notes that they finalized long ago, where there's no real interaction with the professor anyway? And these days, online through Zoom meeting and other platforms, you can have that interaction. You can hit the button that says raise your hand. You can ask a question. So despite the fear of it, and despite the fact that no doubt would lead to the weaker professors being weeded out, don't need them. They're not able to make the transition to this kind of learning anyway. I'm not sure why there's such opposition to it. Just as people have found that when possible they enjoy working from home, why wouldn't students enjoy learning from home? But you see, if you hold to the model that the university is the entree into the ruling class, and if you buy into the argument that that means that the most prestigious universities are going to get you the most prestigious positions within that ruling class, then you might say, well, then you need to be in a dorm room overlooking Harvard Yard. That's the unique value of it. It's the Harvard imprimatur that matters. So we're left with a quandary. Without knowing what the purpose of a university is, we have to give thought before sending our children there what we want them to get out of it. Just because you went to Harvard doesn't mean you're going to be welcome at the next Kennedy Family Touch football game out on Cape Cod. That doesn't happen anymore. So what is it that you want your child to get out of it? And then you have to look at the price of attaining that and decide whether that's a price that we're willing to be burdened with. But I think the days of assuming that a college education is a good thing for everybody, a desirable thing for everybody, are behind us. And I think we're entering an age where we're going to see much more efficient and effective methods of imparting information and skills to people than we've seen in the past. I think we're going to see the vocational and community college education becomes much more attractive as a result, because people are interested in learning to do things rather than desiring to be things. And I think that transition, which this pandemic has accelerated, as in so many others, is scaring the hell out of people who have a vested interest in the status quo. Because at the end of the day, when you set up gates through which you must pass in order to be considered part of some group of people, in order to get greater entitlements, when you do this, when you filter people in this fashion, you give enormous power to the people manning those gates. And that power gets resented over time by the people who are constantly turned away from those gates. And the ambitious and smart among them will find ways around those gates, over, under, around, or through, in order to live the lives that they want to live. And the thing about the people manning those gates is that they tend to invest so much time in making sure that the lock on that gate is strong that they don't pay enough attention to the fact that people have discovered ways to not need the gates at all. And new cultures develop accordingly. Just something to consider as we go into this Memorial Day weekend. Thanks to all those who have served, and thanks to those who have given the ultimate sacrifice in that service. Thank you and have a great day.